all of you who may be viewing or listening to us, not only in America, but also throughout the world. To our viewers in Budapest, Hungary, if you're out there, you're instead. It is Monday, January 23rd, 2023. Recent international news has informed us and the world, especially this country, that we are in an Orwellian stage of doublespeak that is evolving into doublethink. We challenge that. This program is Issues and Answers, and I am your host, Norman A. Carter Jr. Tell your friends and neighbors that we can be viewed via smart television, smartphone, or nearly any dumb computer. All that is required is that you type in your browser, WCEGtalkradio.com, then click Enter. And on the next screen, click the Live Stream tab. Access by smart TVs is easy. Just click on the YouTube icon and search for the WCEG Network. Now, WCEG stands for Worldwide Community Empowerment Group. Our programming goal is to leave you more informed and more empowered than you were before you tuned in. Our motto, we speak life into the community. Now, you may like us on Facebook and view us live and text in your comments and questions. That's what I like about it. You can follow us on Twitter and on Instagram at WCEG_talk_radio and at WCEG Network. Now, the topics and opinions of Issues and Answers are those of the host and my guests, lovely guests, and they are not the opinions of WCEG management. Remember that. So don't harass the management. These shoulders can handle your vitriol and your admiration. Bring it. This is my show, and these are the words and opinions of both me and my guest. So open your ears, open your minds, and get ready to learn. Please take notes, especially at the end of this program, and watch replays of this program on YouTube at any time. Excuse me. But you know what? I woke up this morning with my mind on Stayed on Freedom. Love that song. As we move through the 21st century, there is a growing movement to obfuscate that portion of American and world history that documents hundreds of years of slavery, racial subjugation, and genocide. In 2021, deniers of the European Holocaust ran rampant through the United States Capitol with the tacit support of far too many Republican legislators. Throughout this country, there is a growing malignancy to cloud or whitewash the insidiousness of this country's nearly half a millennium's record of racial subjugation, whether that be internment camps, could be called concentration camps, for Asian Americans in the 1940s, or over 400 years of slavery and racial subjugation of African slaves who through almost Orwellian government speak and assimilation are now called African Americans, but still struggle with that American part because so many of us are not accepted as American citizens. And folks, voter suppression is real and not hyperbole. Now, forgotten are those who have died or risked their lives asserting their human and voting rights in America. Even today, we often hear mention of the accomplishments of the historically conservative NAACP, but few speak of those courageous young people who also came under the umbrella of the Congress of Federated Organizations. They were members of such organizations as the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. These forgotten soldiers of freedom went to battle without weapons, without Molotov cocktails, without breaking windows or destroying property, and without the support of federal, state, or local law enforcement. Their only weapons were truth, courage, and an unrelenting commitment to force America to make good on its pledge of liberty and justice for all. Our guests today are soldiers of freedom. Let's learn their story. First, let me introduce to you Dr. Dan Berger. He is a professor of comparative ethnic studies at the University of Washington, Bothell. He is the author and editor of several books and curates the Washington Prison History Project. Today, we are here to discuss his most recent book, Stayed on Freedom, the long history of Black power through one family's journey. It is published by Basic Books. Next, we have Dr. Gwendolyn Zoharah Simmons. She is Professor Emerita from the University of Colorado, where she taught African American, religious, and women's studies. She is a veteran of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Black Power, Women, and Anti-War movements from the 1960s to this very day. She is a founding member of the National Council of Elders and a board member of the SNCC Legacy Project. Last but not least, Mr. Michael Simmons. He has been a domestic and international human rights activist for 60 years. I know he looks like he's 25, but 60 years, beginning as an organizer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and later as director of European programs for the American Friends Service Committee. Michael's work has taken him to Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. For 18 years, he co-founded and ran the Rade Salon, an independent human rights learning and discussion program in Budapest, Hungary. He also was adjunct professor and taught courses on African American history and US elections at the Budapest campus of McDaniel College. Truth alert, Michael and I met as members of Boy Scout Troop 214 in North Philadelphia when I was about 14 years old. Both of us were classmates at Thomas A. Edison High School and graduated together. WCEG welcomes all of you, all of you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
I'm going to begin my questioning with Dr. Berger, if you don't mind. Dr. Berger, Captive Nation, the Black prison organizing in the civil rights era, I'm kind of confusing myself here. What caused you to almost immediately jump into a project that would evolve into Stayed on Freedom?
Yeah, well, so Captive Nation came out in 2014, and Stayed on Freedom comes out tomorrow, January 24th, 2023. So it's been a while, but in a lot of ways, you know, the idea for this project began before, or at least alongside Captive Nation, because I met Dr. Simmons when she started at the University of Florida as a professor the same year I started there as a freshman. And I was very excited to hear her story of movement activism, and it inspired me to learn a lot more about the civil rights movement and Black Power movement. And, you know, I was struck both by her story and how amazing it is, and but also what was missing from the historical record based on some of her experiences. And after I graduated and I moved to Philadelphia, I met Michael and sort of had the same experience again, right?
Wow.
And so I think the two of them had, you know, we've known each other, 20 years now, more than 20 years in the case of Zoharah. And I think the two of them have always sort of been in my mind as I, you know, read things about the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, and people talk about, you know, no one in the movement did this or everyone in the movement did that, and to just sort of have these examples that show otherwise, right? That sort of expand our sense of where the movement was and when the movement was and what people were up to. And so what I hope State on Freedom, one of the things that I hope State on Freedom does is sort of give a fuller picture of Black power from its origins in the civil rights movement and out of the civil rights movement to the range of campaigns and issues and organizations that continue in some way all the way into the present.
Thank you. Thank you. Michael and Dr. Zoharah, among the praises in State on Freedom are included movement story and a love story all wrapped together. Beautiful, inspiring, heartbreaking, gut-wrenching, and thought-provoking. Now, your meeting in Atlanta in 1965, if I can reveal that, was less than a year after Freedom Summer. That was when core members James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner were assassinated in Philadelphia, Mississippi for attempting to register voters. How did you two find the courage to walk in those same ill-fated steps? Either one can jump in.
So you should.
Yeah. First of all, I went to Spelman College in 1962, and this was when the student sit-in movement was raging across the South. And I am from Memphis, Tennessee, born and raised. So I had lived all of my life in the apartheid South under the Jim Crow laws. And, everyone that I knew hated that system. But people, felt that there wasn't a lot we could do about it because, let's face it, it was, we lived under and in a terroristic society. And all of us Black folk knew that if you got out of line by, protesting, etc., you would be dealt with, and you may be dealt with harshly. So, of course, when the students began sitting in, I was, just thrilled. And so off I go to Spelman from Memphis, Tennessee, and land there at Spelman, and students were marching, demonstrating, going to jail. And even though I had sworn on a Bible to my grandmother that I was not going to get involved, and at that point, when I swore, I really meant it. But it was not, it was hard because the SNCC people, the SNCC office located at 8.5 Raymond Street was about 3 blocks from campus. And they were on campus every day recruiting us to go on the next march, the next demo, etc. And then, there were professors at Spelman, Howard Zinn, Staunton Lynn, who were urging us to get involved. So in spite of my hesitancy and not wanting to break what I had sworn on the Bible to my grandmother that I wasn't going to do, I did get involved. Now, going forward, in my sophomore year, I was elected to serve on SNCC's coordinating committee. That's why it was called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, because the coordinating committee part of it was like a board made up of student representatives from across the South. And I was elected by my comrades there in the Atlanta University Center. And that was made up of Spelman and Clark and Morris Brown and AU and the ITC Theological Seminary. And so that really changed my life because I was going to the meetings, learning from those SNCC people coming in from all across the South for the meetings about what was going on. And the Mississippi delegation, if you will, made up of all the SNCC field staff in Mississippi, were planning the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project. And I was like listening to all the plans. There were going to be freedom schools. There was going to be the organizing of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and trying to get people registered to vote, etc. And I just said, oh, I have to be a part of that. I have to be. And so against my parents, against my grandmother, I signed up to be a volunteer. And we had an orientation session, 2 sessions in Ohio. And because unlike most of the volunteers who were white and middle class, I didn't have any money. And so SNCC put me on payroll. And because of that, big money, $10 a week before Uncle Sam took out taxes. So I think our checks were $9.32. So that was, but hey, it was more than I had. So that enabled me to go, and have a little pocket change at least. But to get back to Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney, the Mississippi Freedom Summer was the summer of 1964. And the orientation took place in Ohio at a Western College for Women. And the first group came in of some 400 plus young volunteers. And amongst that group was James Cheney, the Black man who was from Meridian, Mississippi, and Goodman, Andrew Goodman, one of the white volunteers. And I, met them, we would eat together and I waved them off when they headed to Mississippi. Then the second group came in, and because I was staff, quote unquote, I was there. And the second or third day into the second group's orientation, we were called in by Bob Moses, Jim Foreman, Vincent Harding, Staunton Lynn. They were up on the stage and they were looking exceedingly glum. And they told us that Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner had disappeared. And they said, no matter what lies they're telling down there in Mississippi, they are dead. And we were like, what? I mean, it was like, I had just waved them, 2 of them off. They're dead. And they were like, yes, there's no way that they would disappear. And they offered all of us the chance to go home if we didn't want to continue. And they had been telling us all along that these people were going to kill us and that they were threatening to kill us. And even though they were going to do all they could to try to keep us alive, clearly they couldn't promise us that. So we continued with the orientation with that hanging over us. And I don't recall anyone leaving. So many of us in the second group, all of us went there knowing what had happened. And if anything, being angry and more determined that we had to do this, because this was outrageous that people could be killed for trying to get the right to vote. Thank you.
Well, Michael, I think about, I look at you and I think about our going to Edison and integrated high school, particularly in our class. I mean, we had a club, integrated club, forget the name of it, but great guys. We had a lot of fun. And that sort of gave me a skewed view of what the real world was like. I don't know about you. So here we are coming from our environment, and what caused you to get involved in SNCC?
Yeah, well, mine was a little different than Zoharah. And just picking up on where you left off, I could think about it now in terms of my experiences growing up, because all of my education was integrated and I had white friends from the beginning to the end. I never saw things, at least in my environment, in racial terms. When things didn't go right, I never thought of it as because I was African American.
Right.
And so I saw the racial reality in the Southern sphere. And because my parents both were from the South, Georgia and South Carolina, respectively, I would hear stories, and then I spent time in the South, growing up, going back and forth to both venues, so that that's where I saw race as an issue. In Philadelphia, I didn't see it, and to that degree, I became conscious of race, not in Philly, but again in the South with Emmett Till, and then
Right.
2 years later, Arkansas and the desegregation struggle.
Mhm.
And by then, because I was reading things, my mind started to open up to these issues again, seeing them solely in regional terms. That was part of a youth group called the Philadelphia Cotillion Society.
Yes.
And we talk about racial issues. And there were people around. There was I forget the name of the group now, Fellowship Farm, I think it was called. And there were people, Joyce Barrett and Prathia Hall, who had joined SNCC. And I knew these names, and they would come back, and I would go to small events where they would speak about what was going on in the South. Back then, Albany, Georgia was a very dynamic movement. And then there was a person by the name of John Churchville, who I knew, or at least I got to know. He became a very good friend, who also had been in the South. So I would hear these stories, and I started college in 1963 at Temple University, and I really, really wanted to go to Mississippi in 64, but I had no idea how to do it. I didn't know who to contact or whatever, and I didn't go, and was very frustrated by the fact that I just didn't go. So that after Selma in 65, my sophomore year, myself and my best friend at the time, Dwight Williams, we helped to organize a protest from where we organized students to march from Temple University to City Hall, about, I don't even know the block, about 15, 16 blocks. And we had about 3,000 people there, and it was very dynamic. And I knew at some point that I was going to go south in 1965. That because I'd been south before, I was not necessarily thinking about the danger, but the more I was engaged, I realized that the South, my experiences in the South growing up were much different than the experiences that I was going to experience at the time. Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney were but 3 of others. I mean, there was a person in Selma named Jimmy Lee Jackson. There was a white woman from Detroit named Vala Luiso. So that I knew that death, I mean, that the dangers were there. But, when you're young, you tend to think, it's not going to be me. And, but having said that I always like to point out that, like, I was afraid every single day. I just did not let that fear determine what I did. I mean, what Zoharah said is really important. I mean, you think about, what do you do when you can't call the police? Or even worse, what do you do when the problem is the police? And so that set me off. But I just saw that the way Zoharah saw it, that I refused to allow their intimidation to stop me from doing what I thought needed to be done.
Yeah, that's the true definition of courage. True definition of courage. Dr. Berger, Kianga Yamata, hope I'm saying that right, Taylor, author of hashtag Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, states in part, stayed on freedom powerfully refutes the conventional wisdom of Black power as the destructive undoing of goodwill created by the civil rights movement. Instead, showing it to be propelled by love and an abiding desire for freedom. Was and is the phrase Black power as much maligned as the critical race theory paranoia that has gripped this country today?
Oh, without question. I mean, I think, there's no new playbook on the right. The kinds of things that we are seeing now have been done and done again. I think they keep going back to them because they know how to do them effectively. They know how to weaponize things, weaponize the pursuit of justice against at all costs. So I think that's what we're living through now, but it should be very familiar to us, right? And those of us who didn't live through earlier waves of that kind of moral panic, of that kind of hysteria, should get sort of on the same page quick about it. Because I think when you start trying to sort of fact check demonstrable lies, like, well, critical race theory doesn't really mean this, it really means that, you're missing that these opponents are not making factual claims. They're not trying to. They're trying to sort of stoke fear, and that was immediately apparent in the response to Black Power, including very crucially, I think it must be said, including people who had been sympathetic or even supportive in some cases to aspects of the civil rights movement, now saying, SNCC is a lost cause, or this thing is over. You need to distance yourself from them entirely. And I just want to connect that a little bit to what Zoharah and Michael both shared, because we often think of Freedom Summer as this kind of singular event in the summer of 1964. But, Zoharah stayed in Mississippi for another year afterwards. Michael, when he went down south, was in the summer of 1965 to a project in Arkansas that was also calling itself Freedom Summer, right? That was learning some of the lessons that SNCC of what worked and didn't work in 64, and trying to do something, trying to similarly mobilize people from other parts of the country to come and participate in this project, but having learned some lessons from the year before. And so I think we have this kind of, I think we should have this sort of capacious understanding of freedom as, adaptive and evolving, not just this sort of one slice in time and then everything's fine. Right? And Black Power in particular comes exactly at a moment after the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act have been signed, where folks like Zoharah, Michael, and others were saying there's a lot left to do, right? There's a lot of resistance even to following these laws, and these laws are not everything that we're after, right? That we have a bigger agenda than what these laws would allow. And the book sort of goes through some of the very intense, very violent resistance that they had to contend with after the law had changed, right? After the civil rights movement had won some of its sort of signature legislation. And so I think we have to see the intensity of the opposition to Black Power was precisely because people were naming what needed to change. And so, right, similar to what we see with attacks on critical race theory, attacks on trans people, attacks on any sort of marginalized people or ideas right now, right? It's people who are trying to sort of safeguard the worst forms of power against any kind of change.
Yeah, that's why I brought up at the beginning of the program about the Orwellian double speak and double think, because the words mean something different than what they were intended to mean. And I clearly remember when Stokely Carmichael was speaking of Black power, he was speaking of Black voting power. And then that just went like off the rails, such as the fate of critical race theory. Back to Dr. Berger again, could you please explain the dynamism of and global reach of the Black Power movement as we're defining it now?
Sure, I would much rather have Zoharah and Michael weigh in on that, but I can
okay.
start.
All of you.
I mean, I think it's really important to see, very famously, right, so Stokely Carmichael calls for Black Power at a march in June of 1966. But SNCC had been talking about Black Power for months before that, thanks to a project of SNCC in Atlanta called the Atlanta Project that Zoharah and Michael were both part of. And one of the main things that the Atlanta Project was doing, and even before the Atlanta Project came into existence, was a statement against the US war in Vietnam. And putting out a sort of strong, very, very sharp resistance to the war. And the Atlanta Project also was doing different anti-draft organizing and other sort of anti-militarism work. I think helps us see the global dynamism, right? That Black Power wasn't just a US-based movement, even for people who were born and raised their whole lives in the United States. Going through some of the meeting minutes from the November 1965 SNCC meeting, where they were debating this anti-war statement and seeing Zoharah and others talk about South Africa and talk about the Dominican Republic and talk about Vietnam, and what all of these places and the US involvement in all of those places, what that meant for Mississippi, and what that meant for Detroit, and what that meant for the kinds of battles that activists were waging in the US. I think one of the great strengths of Black Power was its ability to connect what seemed like local concerns to sort of global dynamics and global struggles.
Yeah, Dr. Zoharah, please, if you have any other comments, please jump right in.
Okay, thank you so much. I totally agree with Dan, and it's wonderful, to have worked with Dan, and Mike and I have had hours and hours, of interviews, and certainly after COVID on Zoom, interviews with him, and for us to talk about what we did, why we did it, and for him to help me, I can speak certainly for myself, put it in a much larger context. Now, as Dan has said, SNCC was an organization, while certainly focused on getting freedom, justice, and equality, and Black power for Black people in this country. We also were very aware of what was going on around the world, particularly in Africa. We had a delegation of SNCC people that went to Africa and visited with leaders who had been involved in the liberation struggles. And we certainly had a position on the war in Vietnam. We also had a position on Palestinian rights and opposing the occupation. And so we were already, even, as young people, looking at the connections between our struggle here in this country and struggles of people of color around the world. And even beyond that, particularly when I think of Mike and his work in Europe, that it really extended to all oppressed people. In my case, I spent 2 years in the Middle East, based in Jordan, ostensibly to write my dissertation, but getting totally involved in the women's movements there, fighting for women's rights. So, women's power. And of course, people were eager to learn from me about how we had done the movement for women's rights here in the United States, as well as for Black people's rights. And it was, one of the things that was amazing when I went to Vietnam at the end of the war as a part of an AFSC delegation, because I and Mike worked for the American Friends Service Committee for many years. And, the people who were our drivers and guides, they all knew who Stokely Carmichael was. I was like, what? I mean, here in the jungles of know who
Wow.
Stokely? They were like, of course we do.
Wow.
In the Middle East, they knew who he was, in Jordan and Palestine. So, this movement for people's liberation, I have learned and was learning early on the connections between all of us and our work against imperialism, colonialism, exploitation of the people of the world. So yes, this movement and my involvement in it has expanded me to become a citizen of the world.
Excellent. Michael, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, my take on black. I mean, I agree with what both Zoharah and Dan have said, and like I'd like to look at Black Power a little more insular to the Black community. That particularly the most of us who grew up when Norman, Zoharah, myself, if we admitted, well, let me just speak for myself, that you think that no matter how smart you are, you think the white folks are a little bit smarter, the hair's a little bit prettier, et cetera, et cetera. That even in what appeared to be a equal context, you always kind of deferred to the white person, and so that one of the dimensions of Black Power was that African Americans did not see themselves as equal to white people who were positive white people. I'm not talking about the Klan. I'm talking about people who were helping in the movement. So that the example I give in Mississippi, that like a young African American girl in Mississippi may type 20 words a minute, but then you got this white woman from like Stanford who types 120 words a minute. So then if it's just a question of efficiency, then you obviously give it to her. But the question is, and I always like to tell people now, the process of liberation is as important as being liberated. So that in that context, that if people think I did it, then we really haven't moved forward. That like what Black Power I think did was began to get African Americans to realize their own power within their own community. That because if you look at Black Power and you go back just visually, you see all of a sudden people wearing afros and dashikis and we're talking about Africa and cultural dynamics. I mean, Kwanzaa grew out of Black Power, and there were so many dimensions of our people's struggle that Black Power just unleashed. So that I think that like when we look at it, it was as much a empowerment of our community as it was trying to get power for our community.
And I think what you're saying, and I hope I'm not encapsulating it wrong, but you're talking about a re-socialization of our concept of ourselves, which eventually evolved into what we now call Black pride, which actually saying that threatens some people. But
yes,
absolutely.
and let's just add, Black studies. I mean, all of these things came out of Black Power. And as Michael has said, and being a dark complected Black woman with kinky hair, I mean, I know the liberation, the personal liberation, to be able to say that Black is beautiful. Black hair is beautiful. Black people are beautiful. I mean, so it's an amazing thing what happened that came from just Stokely Carmichael. And I mean, we know it was before then, but because he became emblematic of it, saying Black Power, and then James Brown, I mean, it just
say it loud.
Like, wow, if I say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud, Yeah, it's very, very important for what that did for Black people's self-consciousness and self-realization.
You really struck a nerve with me when you talked about black hair is beautiful. I yearn for those days to come back. But, but you know, you mentioned Black studies. And this is open up for all of you right now. The governor of Florida, and you guys are making, there are a couple of book tour stops in Florida. And the governor there has prohibited an elective Black study program, in high schools. So what's your opinion of that?
Well, listen, I live in Florida, and you know, it's the University of Florida where I taught for 20 years and retired in 2019, and have been very active with the state's African American History Task Force, and my county, Alachua County American History Task Force. The both of those, the state and the local group, work on getting Black history in our public schools. And so we also have a law on the books that's 25 years old when the Democrats ran the state of Florida, mandating the teaching of Black history, Native American history, women's history, Jewish history in our schools. And so what DeSantis is doing is going against a law that's been on the books for 25 years. Now, it was never implemented. This is why we had to have these organizations struggling to get this information taught in our schools. So what DeSantis and the state of Florida Department of Education has done is not only going against a law that's on its own books, but this is nothing but the tip of the spear, you know, for the whole country.
Right.
They are trying to roll back what we have done in the area of Black studies, African American history, Latino history. You know, they do not want this taught. And I've taught African American history here, even though I'm in the religion department. I put religion, you know, in the title of my courses, but clearly it was history. And I saw, and I know Dan can attest to this, that when white students learn this history, it changes them. This is what these people fear.
Yes.
They do not want young people learning the real history of our country. This is what they're really terrified of. And I think the thousands of white people who marched around George Floyd was a wake-up call for them, that we got to stop this from happening, because our young people are going to back away from white supremacy.
Right. And I'm thinking, Dr. Berger, that even in Seattle, where I'm sure you're familiar, that there is also a movement there. I mean, an ultra conservative movement. Would I be incorrect?
Yeah, no, that's correct. I mean, the face of the attack on critical race theory is a gentleman named Chris Rufo, who lives just outside Seattle and who had ran for office in Seattle unsuccessfully, and then sort of took his sort of revanchist racist campaign national, and in fact has just been appointed to the board, I forget the official title, the board of supervisors of New College in Florida, which is a liberal arts college that has had a lot of activism, has been a very sort of progressive bastion as far as a college campus in Florida. And he's there. DeSantis appointed him, I think very deliberately to dismantle it. So, I mean, like Michael was saying earlier, it's easy to understand these things regionally, but this is a national problem. And I just 100% agree with Zoharah. I couldn't agree more that, a major reason why this is happening is, 2020 in particular, but really the last 10 years since Trayvon Martin was murdered, of Black Lives Matter organizing has been very clearly Black-led and Black radical politics that has drawn a multiracial group of multiracial groups of supporters, and has raised the consciousness of young Black people, but also young white people, of mixed race people, of people of various racial backgrounds, of various age backgrounds. And so the ferocity that we're seeing, Florida being unfortunately the leading edge, but the ferocity that we're seeing nationwide is precisely to try to make that impossible.
Right.
It's amazing. I often think about that. Sometimes a dying animal is most dangerous at the time it's approaching death, and I'm hoping that this virulent and hundreds of years long adherence to racist policy is going to die, and perhaps I see this book, this story, as an important vehicle towards that end. I certainly hope so. One thing I went through this when I wrote my book, and I'd like to know from not only Dr. Berger, who would be the conduit for this, but also from my other two guests, that going through your story, did it take you back? And did you go through those same emotions and same feelings that you had when you went through those trials and tribulations? Because I know when I wrote my book, there were times where I had to isolate myself as I relived my story. So I wonder if the same thing happened to you.
For me, no. The times that I've seen documentaries about the civil rights movement, like Eyes on the Prize, for example, Freedom on My Mind, and others, it's kind of, you kind of see yourself, I was a part of that. In the sense of the danger that's involved, that I did not think about the danger that way when I was involved. I was just doing what I felt needed to be done and what I could do at for a given time. I did some things that my logical mind would have said, if you had posed it to me, that I might have said, "Oh no, I'll never do that." But I did that, and right. Proudly so when I say that. So that when you have your head down in the context of struggle, at least for me anyway, you just do what has to be done next. And it is only with some retrospect that I look at it, and I am amazed at some of the things that we did. But no, for me, it's a sense of pride. Okay. I guess. Yeah.
Doctor?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't sort of relive the fear, but what brings me to tears is talking about the people that I worked with, and reflecting back on, for instance, Mrs. Eberta Spinks, who was a resident of Laurel in her 50s, whose door I knocked on as I arrived, after a few days trying to figure out how we were going to get a project going in Laurel. And had a list of names of members of the NAACP, because we had no infrastructure developed in Laurel. And so here's this name, Miss Eberta Spinks. I have no idea what she's going to think about me knocking on her door, asking her, are you interested in us having a Mississippi summer project here? And I knock on her door. I don't know how to ask such a question because, you know, you're asking people, are you ready to put your life on the line, your
Correct.
family's lives on the line, your home on the line, etc. And this lady comes, you know, and she had on her house dress. She kind of reminded me of my grandmother who'd raised me. And she looked me up and down. You know, I had an afro that was a giveaway, you know. And she said, are you one of those freedom riders? And I was like, yes, ma'am. I don't know if I should say yes or no.
Mm-hmm.
And she says to me, come on in. I've been waiting on you all my life.
Wow.
This woman was in her 50s. I was like, oh, I mean, you know,
Wow.
and I was 19. And I was like, oh, your life? Okay. So I run in and, you know, give her the spiel. And she said, what do you need? And I said, well, I need somewhere to stay. And I got 2 guys out there in the car. They need somewhere to stay. And she said, well, you can stay here. This 30 minutes after meeting me, this woman opens up her house to me. And she said, I'm going to get my neighbor to put those 2 boys up. And so she called her, Carrie, we got some freedom riders here. They need somewhere to stay. I'm going to take the girl. And there are 2 guys out there. That was the beginning of the Laurel Project.
Wow.
This woman was a dynamo, you know, and nobody's ever heard of her except when I go around talking about her, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But there were all these people who stood up in the face of, I mean, they were going to lose their homes. They lost their jobs. These people had everything on the line. Now, that's what brings tears to my eyes. And they stood tall because I could hop on the Greyhound and go home, but they were at home.
That does give you chills.
That gives me chills. And it's hard for me to talk about it without even crying to this moment.
Wow. Dr. Berger, in your lap now.
I mean, I didn't have those experiences, and so
Mm-hmm.
I didn't bring it back. But I think, you know, certainly it was very moving for me emotionally to hear these stories. I think there are some things that resonate with me just from being, you know, from my own sort of, time as an activist, or thinking through the risks that I did take and didn't take, or how I decided to choose to take risks about going to this demonstration or that demonstration or something. You know, I think those kinds of challenges that the organizer asked of themselves, to me, was very validating to hear that, you know, echo through time. But I think the stakes of it for me, the context of it for me, is very different from what Michael and Zoharah described of their history. And that also felt very clear. One thing I did also just want to say, I mean, you know, Mrs. Spinks is such a great example of, you know, one of the things that Zoharah talked about in her interviews with me and elsewhere that is in the book is, you know, one of the things that Miss Spinks did, and Michael had similar experience in Arkansas, was also just provide armed self-defense when necessary. And so, you know, I think that sense of what Michael was saying earlier, of like, what do you do when you can't call the police, or when the police themselves are the problem? You know, I think the front lines of the sort of freedom movement at that time give us a wide range of examples, and it includes, you know, Miss Spinks sitting on her porch with a shotgun while Zoharah was asleep.
That's scary, you know, and I think that one of the importances of this book, of this story, is that the courage it took to engage in these activities. Even people forget that people were beaten and probably some even killed for protesting the anti-war movement. I mean, so going from civil rights to anti-war didn't make you any safer. There were pictures on TV. I clearly remember of people being beaten. Anti-war activists were looked upon as being un-American. This was shortly thereafter the McCarthy era. So there was this vitriol against. Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, two to that degree, I just want to touch upon. I know our time is getting short
No,
here.
we're good. We're good.
But okay, but you know that historians tend to talk about the integrated civil rights movement and the white anti-war movement, and which is a totally incorrect way of looking at it. That African Americans were, in fact, I would argue, African American community in general was more opposed to the war in Vietnam as any other community in the country, and reflected that in so many ways, going back to even Malcolm X. That I think that that a lot of my organizing, my latter days in SNCC, were around developing an African American network, not just in the South, but in the Northeast, also opposing the war in Vietnam. I think it's not insignificant that the high school that you and I went to had the highest per capita casualty rate of any high school in the country.
Yes. Yes.
Because basically you're talking about poor Black and white working class people, and who were dying in Vietnam. That the resistance, I mean, that I spent 2.5 years in jail for not going, but others who didn't go to jail just didn't register, and things like that. When African Americans didn't do it, are not considered an act of resistance. But that's exactly what that was. That there were any number of ways that African Americans attempted to avoid the draft at that period. But the important thing to note is that there was very little support in our community for the war in Vietnam. And I just think that it's important that there's much more research that needs to get done. And the fact that a lot of the African American resistance to the war occurred in Vietnam. And I think that also tends to get overlooked when we look at what we consider the anti-war movement.
I think in my memory, and it's clouded because, you know, when you get old, some things fade away. But my memory, the two biggest faces of the anti-war movement in my mind were Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Muhammad Ali. So, I mean, there you go.
Capitalize it. Yeah.
Exactly. And just to underscore the sense of risk involved, the book also talks about, you know, Michael mentioned is 2.5 years in prison for refusing induction to the military. Even before that, though, he and 11 others from SNCC had a demonstration outside the Atlanta Induction Center where, you know, they were arrested, I think it was on a Wednesday. The trial was on Thursday. They were sent to a prison farm. I forget, it's in the book, but either one or two of the people were facing the death penalty for criminal insurrection. I mean, they you know, brought back some old laws to try to, you know, bury them under the jail. And so I think that, and this is, you know, it's a big part of the book. It's an important historical episode. It's barely mentioned in any other account of the anti-war movement of that time period. So I think the sense, as we're all saying, of the Black opposition, the organized Black opposition to the war, is much more profound than people often give it credit for.
And one thing I like to do right now is take care of some business, if you don't mind. State on Freedom, the long history of Black power through one's family's journey, becomes available for purchase tomorrow. How may our viewers and listeners obtain it?
So it should be available wherever books are sold. The Basic Books website lists, you know, will take you to Amazon or bookshop.org or any other number of booksellers. I always encourage people to get it through independent bookstores where they can, but anywhere someone wants to get it is great. And I have a website, danberger.info, where with more about the book and with some links to some of the public events that we'll be doing as well.
Yes, I was going to mention that next. Thank you. And this is the part where I wanted people to take notes. So far, the schedule that I have, your book tour schedule, is January 31st. You're going to be at the Mark Twain House and Museum.
That's a virtual event.
That's a virtual. February 1st, Town Hall in Seattle.
Yeah.
February 7th, the Free Library of Philadelphia. February 9th, Red Emma's in Baltimore, Maryland. 2/23/23, University of Florida, Gainesville. 2/24, the very next day, University of South Florida at Tampa. February 27th, the Langston Hughes Performing Arts Institute in Seattle. And 4/6, big break there, Conversations in Black Freedom Studies at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And I'm just waiting to hear what happens when you guys go to Florida. But
there's been a few other events added as well.
Yes, well, that would be on your website, correct?
Yeah.
Just to mention one that you, well, I don't even know if it's on the schedule, but Chicago for me, February 22nd, for 2 or 3 days. So I do mention that also.
Yep. I'm looking for you guys to be on C-SPAN at some point.
Hopefully.
That's
Would
my
be
hope.
good. I
That's
hope
my
so.
hope.
You know anyone there?
Yeah. You know, it's funny, and this is just a little aside, as of course I don't have the book yet, but and just reading the comments of this story, and it's possible not only national but international impact. I see a movie or a miniseries. I mean, really. I mean, this is the type of story that people want to watch. They want to read about it. They want to watch it, and it's so darn interesting because you bring up so many things that have been clouded. Dr. Dan, we've been asked to repeat the bookstores that it's available again.
Yeah, so people look at the basicbooks.com website for the page. They have links there that will take you to the Amazon page for the book, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, IndieBound, Bookshop, Target, Walmart. You know, any of the major chains will have it, but also, and hopefully first, your independent bookstores as well. Excellent.
Well, guys, I really thank you, and I'd really like to go through and see if you have any closing comments that all of you, any of you would like to make before we close out.
Well, because it's been a treat. One, in terms of you and I coming together, you look at, it's fascinating out of everybody on here. I've known you the longest. But I really hope that our message inspires younger generations to engage and struggle. And as I always say, that like you don't have to necessarily do it full time the way perhaps Zoharah and I have done, but wherever you're at, there's a contradiction of people being oppressed who shouldn't be oppressed. It could be your neighborhood, it can be your job, your school, and that should always cause you to try to resolve those issues while you're engaged in the activity and that you're engaged in. So that, if anything, I hope that young people will be inspired. And I'd like to say, because we're in Atlanta, that my son is known as DJ Drama. And a lot of young folks, you may not know Norman, but a lot of young folks in Atlanta that will resonate with. So maybe that might cause them to look at the book too.
Good. Dr. Zoharah, anything?
Yes, and I say ditto to what Michael said, and it's been such a joy that I've worked with the Dream Defenders when they were first organizing themselves after the brutal murder of Trayvon Martin, and have worked with a number of the Black Lives Matter chapters across the country, some of the leaders from those groups. And I too am hoping that the organizers of today, who are working to bring change to our country and to hold on to the changes that we made in the 60s and 70s and 80s that our society, unfortunately, large percentages of our society are trying to wipe out. So I hope that they will read this book, learn this history, and also be motivated to do what they can do to hold on to the positive changes we made and to go forward and making even better changes or more changes. And thank you so much for having.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Dr. Berger?
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo my colleagues here. I think this is, being able to work on this book over the last 6 or 7 years has been just a true pleasure and delight. And I think, this is in so many ways a very scary and terrifying time in the world. And to me, I think doing this book was a source of hope to try and lift up that sense of endurance of how people, muster up the courage and maintain that courage to be a sort of long distance runner in the struggle for freedom. So I hope that readers will find that in this book as well.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure. Really, my great pleasure. It's funny. I have 5 books here about people from my North Philadelphia neighborhood. This is going to top all of them. This is going to top, and I'm looking forward to having my book by the end of the week. As I close out, Michael, I have to go back to Mr. Leon Homovitz's class for my closing comments, and it's William Shakespeare once wrote that the good that men do is often interred with their bones. Stayed on freedom, the long history of Black power through one family's journey hopes to change that for those freedom soldiers, also known as the Simmons family.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for watching. Please, everybody, buy this book.
Peace. Thank
Have
you.
a good day. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.